This session is titled Knowledge and Praxis. The chair for this session would be Professor Krasimir Stojanov, Professor and Chair of Philosophy of Education and Educational Theory, Catholic University of, I'm really sorry I can't pronounce, Germany. And we'll have one paper to be presented in this session by Professor Ravi Subramaniam from Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education, TIFR, Mumbai. The title of his paper is Conceptions of Knowledge, Informing Education Theory and Practice. Now I call upon the chair and the speaker to the dais. Thank you. His presentation will happen here. So there will be just one presentation in the lecture hall, and they'll all come here, and we'll close the seminar after his presentation. Thank you.
To the last session. So we have a little bit more time since we do have only one presentation. The second presentation will be here. Okay, so you have to work.
Krasimir, and I want to thank the organizers of the seminar for giving me this opportunity to get in touch with philosophy after a long gap. And my main area of work is mathematics education, and I've been working for many years in mathematics education. I need it only for one slide. And but today what I'm going to be talking about is somewhat different, and the title and the abstract that's printed has changed. The talk is different from the abstract, and the title now reads Conceptualizing Knowledge How for Education Theory and Practice. So let me begin my talk. So in this talk I'll explore what we mean by knowledge and how this relates to education theory and practice. The importance of the question of knowledge for education has been indicated by participants at this conference, and some speakers have spoken explicitly and specifically about knowledge. Most educators would agree that mere possession of knowledge is not the goal of education. One must know how to use what one knows. Educators would go further and assert that one must have a critical understanding of the power and limits of what one knows. But at the least, knowledge must have consequences and must manifest in practice in what one does. So it appears that educators are concerned more with knowledge how rather than knowledge that. Knowing how to solve problems in mathematics or to apply mathematics to situations is more important than merely memorizing, say, the properties of parallelograms. But I'll argue that to view knowledge how as completely distinct from knowledge that is mistaken. In other words, I'll argue against a position called anti-intellectualism or non-intellectualism, and in favor of the intellectualist position. So it's the opposite of what Professor Winch was arguing. And I must say, I'm not going to really make a complete or detailed argument. I don't think it's worked out that much, but I'll sketch an argument and sketch the position, the intellectual position, in a slightly different way. And I'll use a couple of examples drawn from the education literature to illustrate my argument. That example will probably have to be just one example. I must mention that I've drawn quite a lot from the writing of Professor Christopher Winch and Bengtson and Moffat and Ryle. I've not really scanned the literature in great depth, but I've learned from these writings and I've formulated my own ideas on that basis. Okay, so the talk is going to be about knowledge how and whether it's really distinct from knowledge that. And what is at stake for educationists in this matter? So broadly speaking, in this debate between the intellectualist and the anti-intellectualist or the non-intellectualist, Broadly speaking, the anti-intellectualist analyzes knowledge how in terms of dispositions rather than knowledge, while the intellectualist analyzes it as a species of knowledge akin to knowledge that. I'm giving a very rough formulation. Now, assuming that that knowledge how is an important goal of education, the two philosophical positions determine alternative formulations of this larger goal of education. For example, among dispositional goals of education, we would include things like liking for mathematics, habits of work and play, patience and willingness to listen to others, and so on. Maybe even certain abilities, if abilities are thought of as dispositions. But do we understand the goal of knowledge how in terms of dispositions such as these, or do we understand it in terms of knowledge as something that can be represented and communicated through shared modes of representation? For example, communicated through language. So this is, I think, the heart of the issue. And that's why it's important for educators. One task for educationists is to examine the most, I think in response to this debate or this distinction or the discussion about knowledge, one task for educationists in my view would be to examine the most important and powerful ideas about the teaching of subjects. For example, the teaching of mathematics. That's a good example, I think. And see whether these ideas are consistent with treating knowledge how as disposition or as knowledge that. Now, the educationist Anas Fard wrote a paper with the suggestive title on two metaphors for learning and the dangers of choosing just one. The metaphors that she was talking about was learning as acquisition and learning as participation. And these metaphors are not unrelated to the debate about knowledge how and the two positions. But perhaps the disposition of the educationist is different from the philosopher's disposition in not choosing just one position. Anyway, but today I'll argue for the intellectualist position, that knowledge how is closer to knowledge that rather than to dispositions. Part of my motivation comes from the fact that the intellectualist position, as has been articulated by most intellectualists and anti-intellectualists, draws on a rather narrow conception of knowledge that as propositional knowledge. Now, this stricture is unnecessary and it's indefensible considering the richness of the notions of knowledge that an educator works with. Knowledge of theories and organized subject areas, for example, as opposed to single propositions. I think there are German distinctions in the German language for these kinds of knowledge. Knowledge of concepts, knowledge of procedures and processes, including heuristics, which is not quite knowledge, perhaps. Knowledge that can be represented in non-verbal and non-linguistic modes such as gesture or visuospatial representation, distributed knowledge, and so on. All of this is still closer to knowledge that than to dispositions, in the sense that they are representable and communicable. I'll take the position that the criterion of communicability through a variety of modes of representation is a primary criterion in judging something to be knowledge that. And so that will be my criterion rather than the fact that it's just propositional knowledge. Tacit knowledge does not meet this criterion, nor does disposition, but knowledge how does. Okay. I want to first make some preliminary clarifications about what the word knowledge means. I think it's important because I sometimes feel that underlying a lot of what educators say, or even sometimes some philosophers, there's an understanding, this point is not very clear, which I'm going to say now. That firstly, that I take the predicate to know as a two-place predicate. For example, it's shown in the schematic sentence that A knows X. So in the first place, the predicate can be applied only to persons. That's in the position A, they can only be persons, or if you want to be more abstract, you can say epistemic agents. It makes sense, therefore, to say that some person has knowledge, but not that this book has knowledge, except indirectly as a kind of circumlocution. In other words, knowledge is not something external, but personal. It's a state that a person can be in. The second place in the predicate refers to the content of what is known. Knowledge is always about something. So I know Gopal, I know that quails don't build nests. I know how to reach Nias from Bangalore airport, etc. But the content of knowledge is not, strictly speaking, knowledge. I mean, it is knowledge is more properly thought of as the epistemic state of an agent who knows. By knowledge, we mean only the content of knowledge often, but this is misleading and it misses out an important aspect of knowledge. I think this is also important for the argument I'm making, that knowledge is something belonging to persons and not something existing out there. And this view, I think, would be sort of comforting for educators to know that this is indeed the dominant view even in philosophy, in epistemology. And it's reflected in the fact that the analysis of knowledge begins with the analysis of beliefs. A knows X is taken by most philosophers to mean that the person has a true belief backed up with adequate justification. And beliefs are personal epistemic states, and therefore so is knowledge. So, of course, as I said, I'm not going to restrict myself to propositional knowledge alone, but certainly the fact that the definition of knowledge or understanding of knowledge as associated with persons, predicated of persons, is important. Okay, as I said, my focus is on knowledge that allows one to do something. It may not be practical knowledge in an everyday sense. My examples will be abilities that are typically learned with some effort and over time, and have aspects of both doing and knowing. To use the words of the philosopher Ryle, I hope this is not very misleading to educationists. He says that it includes actions to which one can apply intelligence epithets, or which involve the application of mind. For example, a person writes a computer program intelligently, a person builds a roof of a house with some foresight, solves a problem elegantly, reasons persuasively, etc. All of these examples involve knowledge of how to carry out the task. While these examples are mostly of expert performance, they are similar to what we expect school learning to look like. So they're not very different from what we aim for in school learning. And educators apply intelligence epithets to student performance. And so when we reject rote learning, so we intend that students apply what they learn thoughtfully, and so on. Now, so my talk is not quite about expert performance, but I think what I say will also apply to expertise or expert performance. And there's one kind of expert performance that educators specifically are greatly interested in, and that's the practice of teaching itself. Now, teaching is expertise that is knowledge intensive, but I'm not going to refer explicitly to the kinds of knowledge implicated in teaching. But I think if what I'm saying is valid, it's acceptable, it should have some implications for understanding the kind of knowledge that builds teacher expertise. Okay, so now let me give you an example of one example from mathematics. I'd intended to discuss two, but I'm just going to discuss one example. And this is the example, so you can take a look at it. I think we need that. Okay, so can everyone see that? So that's a problem. Okay, so this is quite a famous example in mathematics education. It was used by the psychologist Wertheimer, who was a Gestalt psychologist working in the early decades of the 20th century, and he used it to argue against behaviorists like Thorndike. He said that, well, you can see. So, what's the answer to this problem? Okay, so Wertheimer said that when he gave this problem to many students, so he observed that they started to add each of those 587s laboriously, and then went on to divide by 5. And he said that this illustrated his point about learning being a sort of meaningful whole. So now, so let's focus a bit on that example. And we know from introspection that there's another quicker way of doing the problem. And we find some students who indeed do the answer, get the answer without much effort at computation. So there are certainly different ways to solve the problem. And some students know a better way and others do not. And as educators, we are interested in having our students do it in the better way. So when I come back to this example, I will use this phrase that the student who adds 587, 5 times, does not know how to do this problem. So it's a way of speaking. Actually the person can solve the problem by laboring through the steps, might, of course, increases the possibility of error and so on. So in a manner of speaking, I'll say that he or she does not know how to solve this problem. Okay, now just to put this in the context of behaviorism, a teacher who's internalized core ideas of behaviorism might protest that the question is unfair. Now, I'm done with the slides, so we can do away with it. See, it's unfair to ask students this because they have not been taught this efficient way of solving such problems. So this sense of unfairness comes from the fact that the behaviorist believes that you must break up what needs to be learned into small fragments and have students learn the fragments one at a time. So if there's another way to solve the problem, the behaviorist believes that that must be taught with a sufficient number of examples. Now this is of course countered by the fact that a large number of people, including many of you, who know the more efficient way have not been explicitly taught this method. And this is the Gestalt psychologist's point, that what we learn and what children ought to learn is a meaningful connected whole, not a collection of fragments of knowledge. Okay, this is just a quick and possibly unsatisfactory analysis, but I'll come back to the example again. But let me go back to knowledge how. And so we don't have it. Okay. Knowledge how, that is knowing how to carry out a task, is contrasted with knowledge that something is the case. Now, even to say that somebody knows that X, so it knows some proposition, has some propositional knowledge, even that requires some doing. We must have some basis for saying that the person knows, and if A knows X, A must be able to demonstrate that knowledge. And what does this demonstration consist in? It could be quite minimal. It could just be that A assents. Suppose you say X and A might assent to X. This is, of course, a rather minimalist understanding of what, to say that somebody knows that something is the case, it just means that the person must assent to the knowledge. It's a very minimalist notion. And so if A knows X, you would expect her to do something more than merely assent to X. And this is a point which is made quite nicely by Gilbert Ryle in one of his passages. He said that if you want to really test that somebody knows something, you must test it in different circumstances. Maybe the person doesn't really know, so you must probe it in many ways and so on. And this goes to show that even for ascribing knowledge, that it's not a simple matter. It has to do with action in varied circumstances and in many different ways and so on. So that's just a point to keep in mind. Now, this question of how do we say that A knows X is an important one. That is, what do we mean when we ascribe knowledge of X to A? Now, we are not asking for practical criteria which allow us to evaluate A's knowledge, which is important, of course, but not for the moment. But we are inquiring into what this question reveals about the nature of knowledge. That is, the nature of knowledge must be such that we can, with reason or with reasons, ascribe it to some person. So this is what is being called the ascription criterion, and it's a strongly held intuition that philosophers employ, and they employ this to argue against they employ this to argue in favor of or against their positions. Just give me a minute. Copy with me. Okay. Now, I just wanted to refer back to the example, which I don't know whether you noticed that in Professor Wincher's talk, which is an example used by other philosophers as well. The example of a skier, Pat, who teaches skiing, but I mean she knows how to ski, but she cannot ski herself. So are we correct in saying that she knows how to ski? This is really the discussion. And one argument is that you cannot ascribe this knowledge to Pat unless she is actually able to ski. The other argument is that no, under certain conditions you can, even if the person cannot ski. For example, let us say that Pat the skier was a good skier but has lost the ability for some reason. So would you say that Pat has also lost a knowledge of how to ski? Because, for example, it might be demonstrated in the fact that she can train others to ski. She can teach or she can guide the learning of skiing by others. So this is important because I think I'm just giving this as an example because philosophers look for these intuitions that we naturally have about when we ascribe knowledge or knowledge how to a person and use that to either defend or attack some positions. My point is a little different. My point is that besides the ascription criterion, knowledge in general and knowledge how in particular must also be teachable or communicable. It must fulfill a communicability criteria. And this is not something that philosophers, I think, have paid adequate attention to. And I argue that it's an equally important criterion which expresses the intuition of educators. Now, the ascription criterion, we are talking about knowledge how. So, it must fulfill the ascription criterion as well as the communicability criterion. And it seems to me that the ascription criterion and the communicability criterion pull in opposite directions. The first requires that knowledge be demonstrated through performance, while the second requires that knowledge be represented in some communicable form through language, gesture, or other kinds of representation. So my argument in brief is that the anti-intellectualist argument that knowledge how must be understood as an ability or disposition does not do justice to the communicability criteria. Okay, if we adopt the intellectualist position, so which is what I'm going to do, we are not constrained, as I said earlier, to interpret knowledge how only in terms of propositional knowledge. Now, there is a version of non-propositional intellectualism called objectualism, if you like, which is being put forward by Bengtson and Moffat, which Professor Winch also referred to, where knowledge how is interpreted in terms of knowledge of objects instead of propositions. So kind of knowledge by acquaintance of objects. For example, you would reformulate this sentence, I know how to reach Nias, as I know the way to reach Nias, the way being an kind of object, if you like. This version of intellectualism, in my view, takes the right step in going beyond propositional knowledge. However, recasting knowledge how to do F, how to do something, F, let's say, as knowledge of a way to do F is to an educationist, I think, consistent with exclusive focus on procedures in teaching and learning. It doesn't really accord with the intuitions of an educator about what is fruitful or what is a fruitful interpretation of knowledge how. Okay. Instead, I propose that we must understand the exercise of knowledge how as enabled by having the requisite conceptual and propositional knowledge. So that, of course, propositional knowledge, but also important is conceptual knowledge. And I think this is somewhat important, an appropriate subsumption under a concept. That is, that it's not just having the knowledge, it is knowing how to apply the right knowledge or the right concept to a given situation. So this is nothing but the act of categorizing an experience, or it could be through perception, it could be through inference. It's close to what we mean by seeing as. So I think seeing as has not been analyzed sufficiently in the context of understanding knowledge how, and particularly in the context of what's important in education. Subsumption under a concept cannot be analyzed as a disposition because it's episodic. It's part of what we mean by knowledge. So it's episodic. Of course, dispositions can manifest in episodic ways, but it's also, applying a concept is what we normally understand as part of knowledge, not as part of disposition. Now, let me just illustrate what I mean by taking an example which is quite different from theoretical knowledge. It's, say, the practice of singing. Suppose a music teacher wants to teach the student to sing a particular note and to get the note right. Now, this is like having, not just having a concept of a note. Let us say the fifth wants to teach the correct way of singing the Gandhar, let's say Komal Gandhar, so the third. You need to have a concept of that third, in the sense, given a sound, you must be able to categorize it as correct Gandhar or not, and you must be able to produce that as well. So the teacher does this by producing many examples or many instances of the Komal Gandhar and guides the student to herself or himself produce that sound. So this is, I think, a typical case of learning both the concept or the category of what that object is and to be able to recognize instances of that as well as to produce that. I think this is a fairly simple example, but it's very important to analyze the kind of knowledge that we're interested in teaching and learning, and to also analyze knowledge how. Okay. Now, seeing as is a part of perception, but it's guided by concepts. Now, interpreting as is also in some sense like seeing as, but it's more inferential. And both of these are episodic in the sense that they're forms of responsiveness to what is presented through perception. Now, knowledge how plays a role in guiding action through right seeing as and interpreting as. So this aspect of knowledge how has perhaps not been given the central place that it deserves. So bringing this to the center stage, I think, allows us, okay, what is to be gained by focusing on seeing as and interpreting as? One is that, I think I just mentioned this, that in teacher education, the notion of noticing, that a part of what the teacher's expertise consists in is to notice certain things which are going on in the classroom, or to notice certain things which students are saying, is extremely important. I mean, it is mostly about noticing. This is the expertise of an extremely complex activity or function like teaching. And what really is noticing? Noticing, I think, is seeing as, and so we must really have an adequate account of that. The notion of noticing is by John Mason, who's an educator from the Open University, UK. Okay. The other point about seeing as, I think it accounts for the educator's intuition about the power of collective learning. and the power of discursive engagement within a space like the classroom. What does this discursive engagement really bring? It brings the sharing of multiple perspectives. Right? It's not merely the sharing of different propositions, it's the sharing of perspectives and of interpretations. And this is really has to do with seeing as. So I think a complete account of knowledge how will need an analysis of seeing as or interpreting as and so on. There's another thing that is important, which is the role of inference in guiding action. But I'm not going to say a lot about that. I mean, this argument is still work in progress, and I need to work more on that. Okay. How much time do I have?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So, now let me go back to that arithmetic example. So maybe you can go. So that's it in front of, there it is in front of you. So there should be no disagreement over the fact that there are at least two different ways of solving the problem, and that one is superior to the other. And what else can we agree about? We could say that the second approach is a more intelligent approach, that it shows the application of intelligence. I mean, well, the word intelligence shouldn't raise a red flag. I mean, it's not being applied to a person but to an action. So I think educators would not have a problem with saying that some actions reflect more intelligence. I'm not talking about people being more intelligent or not. Okay. So now this connects with current debates in epistemology about what we mean when we apply the predicate intelligent to an action. I mean, this is really the debate about knowledge how. I think we would also agree that the action that's of solving the problem here has something to do with knowledge. I don't think anybody would really deny that seriously. And the teacher may interpret a student, let's say student A, who laboriously adds 587 5 times as having failed to learn something that another student who solves the problem quickly knows. So let's call her student B. Now, I argue that B's knowledge is a kind of knowledge how, and its proper analysis will show that what B knows is not fundamentally different from knowledge that. Okay, so now I'll just anticipate a counter argument and respond to that. The counter argument could be that this example is not really one of knowledge how, but it's really knowledge that packaged or disguised as a doing task. It's not knowledge how like driving a car, for example. It's not a practical kind of knowledge. One could say that. So then it's important to really be clear about what we mean by knowledge how, by calling something maybe practical knowledge. And so there could be different criteria. First is that it's manifested only practically. However much somebody verbally describes the nuances of driving a car, right? You might give a long lecture on it. Nothing really tests knowledge of driving as driving itself. Right? So indeed, this seems to be the only real test. So this could be one criterion or argument. Secondly, we can talk of B as being a better driver than A, or that B knows how to drive a car better. In the case of knowledge that, it does not make sense to talk about degrees of knowing. You either know something or you don't. But in the case of knowledge how, it makes sense to talk about degrees. So, so if I know that quails don't build nests, I cannot know this better than someone else. Okay, thirdly, of course, we have shown that this is something practical, driving a car. But we also need to show that it's some kind of knowledge how. So we can apply, this is explained by saying that we can apply intelligence predicates to driving. So B drives more carefully, more attentively, and so indeed it's got to do with knowledge, with applying something maybe consciously and so on. It's not merely a physical ability. Okay, so now it seems that, this task is really different from driving a car. And it seems that knowledge how to solve the example of this arithmetic task okay, so we can test this, actually we can test this by not really asking B to solve this task. We can just ask her, how will you solve this task? And if B gives an account of how this task can be solved, we take that as completely acceptable. I think this is similar to the argument that is made by Professor Winch. So if B verbally described how the problem can be solved, we would generally accept that she knows. Right? This is, however, not because 5 minutes? Yeah. Thank you. This is, however, not because solving the arithmetic problem is not practical, but because it's not complex. Now, it can be carried out fully by a person on the basis of instructions alone, provided the person just understands the instruction. Now, if I tell you how you can solve this problem, you'd probably solve it. I mean, you say that, okay, just write, it's multiplication and division, so just write 587, and so that would be sufficient for you to solve the problem in some sense. But this is not because the problem is not practical, but it's just because it's simple. So if there is a task which is completely determined, whose success is completely determined by just having a set of instructions, it doesn't mean that the task is not practical. For instance, if I have assembled a toy microscope by merely following the instructions printed in the manual, it doesn't mean that I've accomplished a theoretical instead of a practical task. So it's just the simplicity and complexity. Now we can say that B's solution to the task is better than A's. We can also assert that B will become better at problem solving with practice and exposure to harder problems. So I think one can also talk of degrees of knowing with regard to how to solve problems. And if problem solving in general is all about knowledge how, then so is problem solving in this particular case. I mean, if general problem solving is not, it's also an example of, in some sense, practical knowledge or know-how, then so is this, which is a part of that general problem solving ability. Okay, so it's difficult to deny that solving the problem involves, or we need to accept that it involves knowledge how. Okay. And I just want to note that any ambiguity actually in classifying something as knowledge how or knowledge that should alert us to the fact that there's a very close relation between the two, and it's quite difficult and perhaps not justified to hold this distinction strictly. Okay, so now I just want to spend the remaining couple of minutes putting in front of you some interpretations of, that should have been interpreting A's, not A's solution, but A's lack of, A's inability to solve it. So you could say that A does not know how to solve the problem. A lacks the ability to solve the problem. A does not know the method of solving the problem. You can say A lacks knowledge that will enable him to solve the problem. You could even say that A has the requisite knowledge but does not apply what he knows. Or you could say that A has requisite knowledge but lacks understanding. Now each of these really needs to be unpacked, and we need to see whether this is the implicit understandings of knowledge how as disposition or as part of knowledge, and of course to exercise our intuition about what is most productive. I'm not going to do that. 0 or 1? 2 minutes, okay. But I'll just summarize in a minute by saying that okay, so I'm essentially is an important criterion, and we need to assess accounts of knowledge how by that criterion. And that the second move that I'm making is that the nature of knowledge or the nature of knowledge implicated in knowledge how is not really only propositional knowledge. So the intellectualist position needs to be underwritten by a broader conception of knowledge which is representable, or explicit knowledge if you like, explicable knowledge. I think this is a term also used by Professor Winch. Now one of those aspects of knowledge is appropriate categorization, or seeing as or interpreting as in an adequate manner, which is also being termed noticing in the education literature, and which also explains in some sense why educators feel that the interplay of perspectives is important in learning. Okay, so I'll stop there.
12 minutes for discussion. Do you prefer to answer the question one by one, or shall we group the questions?
One by one would be
One by
better, I
one.
think, yeah.
Okay.
Sir, regarding knowledge, it seems that we are caught up in a very strange dilemma. Because if we consider knowledge as an acquisition, then it reduces down to just information in the form of memory. And if you consider that as a skill, then again it reduces down to the set of physical actions, activities, which turn into the dead mechanical habit. So isn't there any room left for knowledge in the real sense of knowing as such? Thank you.
Thank you. I think, so that's really an important question. I mean, we know that we don't want knowledge to be inert, as Whitehead said. So it must be, I think that's the point of saying that it is indeed knowledge how, that it must be reflected in action. It must be reflected in something that you do. And of course, it is not, just because it's reflected in action, it's not just teaching somebody how to do something. It's not teaching the method of solving a problem or to do a procedure, which can happen very often in education. So, which is to say that knowledge how is not simply knowledge of a way to do something, right? So it is, so I think what educators feel, what is really fruitful about looking at, what we are trying to teach is knowledge. And for that we need a richer conception of knowledge. At the same time, it's not merely disposition, I think, because disposition is not a concept that can guide the activity of teaching and learning. You need to unpack this, and you need to unpack it in terms of knowledge-like concepts, and which, so I'm saying it's not only propositions, but concepts and so on, much more. Thank you.
Ravi, that problem that you put on the board, you gave two possible ways of solving it.
Yes.
One you said was an actual solution, the other you said was, you don't know, he failed to solve it. There are at least two more ways in which you can do it.
Sure, of course.
Now, so you can keep on analyzing it, that the two ways which probably indicate an awareness, and depending and also indicates how smart the student is, and how recalcitrant is it, with whether the students wants to play along with you in answering that question or play you up. For example, he could say it was 185 plus 185 plus 185 is 185 bracket 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. Then you add the 1 plus 1 to 5, and then he divides it.
Right.
Or he could divide one of the 185s, or not 185 by 5, and
Add it 5 times.
and add it all together 5 times. So the question is, how do you analyze this in various ways? You are ignoring the role of the student who's responding in arriving at your analysis. And also, is it not bordering on sophistry to say that one is correct and one is not? And if I go into these all further details and then try and, you gave at least what, about 10 possible interpretations of the failure of the student to do that.
Yeah.
Also, let me give you a slightly related but slightly more complicated example, which also, what I call the...
So can I respond?
No, it is related, so let's just... which is what I call the Bata effect. I mean, Bata has this penchant for pricing everything as $29.99 or $49.99. And you could pose the problem that suppose you went to a shop and bought a pair of shoes and they cost 99 rupees 99 paise, and you buy 5 shoes because 5 of your children need it. So what is the total? Now, the smart way of doing it, as you would say that realize that 99.99 is 1 paisa less than 100. So you multiply it by 5 and then you subtract 5 paise from it. But I know of many students who are quite adept at solving this problem, who would actually multiply 99.995 times and arrive at the answer.
Yeah, sure.
So it's not always easy to, what I'm trying to say is that your interpretation need not always be as simple, even though the problem and the solutions are so simple.
No. The purpose of, I sort of apologize for saying that solution was wrong. What I just meant is that it would be a fair statement to say that A, who just went on adding, failed to understand something important about the problem. And you're right. So we need tools that will guide us in teaching. And if we think that different ways of looking at that problem are important, different solutions, and what are these different solutions based on? Based on noticing different things about the problem. For instance, I could have just, instead of having 587 5 times, I could have had it just 4 times. And then that can lead to some other things as well. But all of these are aspects of knowledge. And I think that it will be a mistake to say that what we as teachers aim at teaching in the context of problems such as this is disposition, not knowledge. So we need to recognize firstly that it's knowledge that we're dealing with, and that this knowledge involves the concept of knowledge that we have must allow, for example, different interpretations of the same problem. It must allow for the pedagogical power that we recognize as educators of sharing of different perspectives, and the fact that it leads to learning. This is the point I'm making. I'm not interested in pushing a certain analysis of the problem. I'm looking at the underlying concept of knowledge that will inform or guide educational practice.
Are there 2 more questions? You first. Okay. You go ahead. Okay.
How does this fit into your framework? When I teach, say, philosophy of education, I try to develop something like a Socratic spirit. I mean, the ability of students to enter a text in a Socratic spirit, which might include the ability to relate different authors to each other, as opposed to simply saying, well, this is what this guy says and this is what this guy says, and that's it. Instead, they go beyond that, and Rousseau, when we look at Rousseau in the light of Aristotle, we find such and such. So this is sort of a bent of mind, a Socratic spirit, intellectual turn of mind. How does that fit in to your framework? Is that a form of knowledge? Is that a skill? What is it?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I haven't thought sufficiently about it. But it seems to me that even the point that I heard in the morning in your talk about judgment, that judgment is important. But it seems to me that seeing as something, interpreting something as something, I mean, it's the application and the play of concepts. Right? It's learning a concept, learning to apply a concept. So it certainly has something to do with acquiring certain knowledge-like elements. I mean, I don't know if it's illuminating to think of it as a skill, but I don't really know. I don't have a deeper analysis of this, I think.
Just one more sentence.
Yeah.
In the US now, we are supposed to write student learning objectives, even at higher education levels. So in my syllabus, I'm supposed to write, when we discuss Rousseau, the student learning objective is X. And one problem I have with that is I can't express instilling a Socratic spirit in the student's mind as a learning objective. That's not specific enough. So it's not a form of knowledge that I can get my mind around, and yet it's the most important thing that I teach.
Thank you.
Okay, last question.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I have been dealing with this question of know how and know that in my research also very specifically. Yeah. So for me, like my research is in sensitivity about discrimination. And as you said, the very important criteria for you is communicability through language or gesture or action. And in my classroom, for example, if a teacher is talking about sensitivity, and in language, obviously, you can put it easily and you can talk about it and you can evaluate it easily. But what about practice? And then if you are not communicating that sensitivity through practice, or you are communicating the other way maybe, so then how do you engage with it? So in that sense, isn't the practice component more important than just being able to talk about it in some ways and evaluate based on that?
Sure, I agree completely. And I think even simple forms of knowledge like this need you to test it, that it should be tested through practice. This is really working within the ascription criterion. And I completely agree that it needs either a disposition or skill or even knowledge that to be demonstrated through action. My point is about how do we characterize it so that it becomes something which we can communicate or which we can teach also. And I think we need to analyze it in terms of knowledge elements for that purpose.
Yeah, but if it is a language of practice and not in the articulated domain, can we still take it as a communicable thing?
See, the only criterion, I place is that it should be explicable, representable in some way. Tacit knowledge, there might be elements of tacit knowledge, and I acknowledge that. And I don't have an analysis of that. I don't think that fits in this framework. And tacit knowledge is important in acquiring ability and expertise. And it's not, I don't even know if it's a form of knowledge. So it is really like an ability. And how does one acquire this? I don't have an adequate account. Maybe you observe things, you imitate things, you internalize certain images. I don't know what a correct or an adequate account of tacit knowledge is. I have no idea. So, but that's indeed a problem, and that's an important dimension of knowledge.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Subramaniam. Is that correct? Subramaniam? So, as far as I understood, the second paper of the other session is going to take place here. Is that correct?